once upon a time, or maybe it was yesterday, or on the way in across town this morning, I got really stuck in traffic. Or maybe that's not your story. Maybe your story is you came by train, as I actually did, and froze on the walk up from the station. We share these stories from experience every day. They are part of being human. They are what helps us to connect with each other, to feel as if we are actually part of the same crowd, part of the same tribe, the same mob. Yes, people around here have had the same experiences as me, and isn't that fantastic? We do it all the time. When you listen, really listen to the stories of people who have had eating disorders, you see eating disorders a little differently. And your responses to eating disorders will change a little too. Lived experience knowledge can only be acquired through direct personal experience. People with lived experience and their families and supporters hold unique insights. Insights into the pathways into illness, insights into how illness is understood in their lives, insights into the impact that it has on their life, on their feelings, on their identity, on their relationships, on their energy levels, and insights into how treatment feels when you're on the receiving end. What counts, what doesn't count in the interactions that we have when perhaps those of us on the professional side of things think we're saying all the right things, but actually it's received in quite a different way. These are the insights that come from lived experience. They also bring to us insights from that long and practical journey of personal recovery, which often takes place outside the treatment rooms. It's something that happens in daily life, not something that happens in the clinic. This slide and the following slides are taken from the NEDC Stories from Experience resource. About 5 years ago, the Australian government asked the NEDC to develop a resource to encourage consumer participation. And we kind of threw up our hands in horror and said, but we've already written the guidelines on consumer participation. Where do we go from here? We came up with the bright idea of developing a full-scale, self-directed learning resource. A resource that would take people on a journey from reflecting on their own experience for their own benefit in personal recovery to learning strategies that would enable them to safely and purposefully share their story in different contexts to help different people understand eating disorders. It's taken us a few years to move from a good idea to a hard copy resource, which you can download, to an online resource, but we are now actually there. Information on the online resource is displayed in a poster just outside above the resource table. You may have seen it already, but if you haven't, I do encourage you, when we take the tea break, go outside and have a look at it, make a note of the website and go and have a look. This is a resource that was co-produced. It was equally produced by people with lived experience, including people with direct experience and their family members, and by people who have some experience in advocacy, in writing, in performing arts, in using social media. In other words, people with a lot of technical skills. It tells a story in itself. It's a story of recovery. It tells you about the things that people learnt along their journey in recovery that they really wish they'd known at the beginning. And they really wish their treating clinicians had known too about the experience of recovery. It tells a very powerful story of hope and achievement. Like all the NEDC resources, it is based on the best available evidence. I'm going to be honest and say there's not that much evidence around, but to the best of our abilities, it is evidence-based. And it fits with current policy directions in mental health. So it fits with person-centred care, it fits with recovery-oriented care, it fits particularly with peer support and peer work, and consumer participation generally across the spectrum of things that happen in mental health services. It comes in two parts. The first part helps people to make sense of their illness and their recovery as part of building their own resilience in recovery. The second part provides lots of different ways to explore what it might be like to share the story purposefully to help others. So it looks at everything from being a representative on a committee to being an advocate to participating in education or just being a peer supporter and helping other people. It talks about the way in which sharing stories can raise awareness, how it can reduce stigma, which is an issue I think you're probably going to hear a bit about as we progress with today's session. It talks about how you can put all that professional education on how to treat eating disorders into the context of the people actually on the receiving end without having to treat a lot of people with eating disorders before you understand what's happening. And it talks about helping to design services that actually meet people's needs. It is a resource. It's something to be dipped into and used selectively. It's not a book to be read from beginning to end. So with that in mind, thinking of it selectively, it could be used as a guided self-help process for people working through personal recovery. I stress personal recovery. It is not a treatment resource. It is not an alternative to treatment. It is an adjunct for people who would like a little help journeying through personal recovery. It can be used as a focus for peer support groups, a bit like a book club. You've got some activities that you can share together and work with. It can be used in peer worker training. I haven't tried this, but I believe it could even be quite useful in training health professionals in thinking about, well, if that's what it feels like sharing my story, wow, what am I asking my clients, my patients to do when I ask them to tell me what it's like to have an eating disorder? Yeah? So it's got some potential there in training. And it can also be used as a communication tool for those it works with between the person and their supporters or the person and their health team, particularly perhaps for people who might prefer to work through things like writing poetry or drawing pictures rather than just sitting telling a story. But the resource is only a tool. The important thing is the access it gives to all of us to the knowledge from lived experience. So today I'm going to introduce to you 3 people who will share something, just a little bit, of their journey through an eating disorder. Sharing from lived experience takes courage. We are asking people to dip back into the most vulnerable parts of their lives. We are asking people to share parts of themselves that are probably hidden on an ordinary everyday basis. And indeed they might prefer to keep hidden, at least some of the time. It takes courage and it takes hard work to share the knowledge of lived experience. I know for the people that we're going to listen to today, this may be the hardest thing they've ever done. So, as you listen to that. Listen to the similarities between the people I'm going to introduce, but listen to their differences too, because eating disorders don't come in one size or shape or one story. And listen too to the importance of sharing that knowledge and the urgency of having access to the right kind of treatment. I'd like to start by introducing Braden Fitzsimmons. Braden is 22 years old. He comes from Victoria. And he's here today to share his journey with bulimia nervosa, but also as a voice for all the young men who are struggling with an eating disorder of any variety. He has suffered from bulimia since about the age of 16, something that perhaps we don't think about, don't expect when we're looking at 16-year-olds. After 12 months of therapy, he's now recovered, and he's going to share something of his journey with us. Thank you, Braden. There we are.
All right. Just this. How you going? Yeah. So, my name's Braden. To be completely honest, I didn't know I was doing a full speech today. So I guess, everything that I'll be talking about is just straight off the top of the head and from the heart, I guess. But as Lesley mentioned, when I was 16, I kind of went through pretty big personal change. So I was quite an overweight kid growing up, and decided that I wanted to lose some weight. And over that summer, from going from year 10 to year 11, lost a decent amount of weight, and I did it the right way. It was one of the best things I ever did, but at the same time, it brought on an abundance of, I guess, body image issues and fears of putting that weight back on. And I guess due to those kind of fears and whatnot, I started, developed kind of bulimic-like behaviours. So from the age, I guess, of 16, for the next kind of 18 months, I was performing these bulimic behaviours and purging and kind of the misuse of laxatives. And at the time, I didn't really know that what I was doing was an eating disorder, behaviour. I had no kind of education throughout my schooling or even just kind of in the community about eating disorders. So therefore, like, what I thought I was doing, I thought, I'd kind of hit the jackpot in keeping, at an appearance and at a weight that I thought was great. And still, I guess, indulging in the foods that I loved. But then the negative side of it, was obviously the purging and that. But at the time, I didn't really consider it to be a bad thing because I didn't know what it was. I didn't know what I was doing. So from then, when I was about 17, I actually, I slowly started to feel, myself to become quite depressed, and felt a lot of anxiety come on, and, I noticed a massive change in all of my moods. I just wasn't happy in everyday life. I did a quick Google search of kind of my symptoms, and, I think I actually Googled, is it healthy to make yourself, vomit? And the first thing that came up was, bulimia. And I remember reading the word and I was like, I have kind of heard that word before. And then, did another Google search of bulimia. And then from there I was kind of like, okay, so I have an eating disorder. And, being a 18 year old, I didn't know how to get help. I didn't know who to talk to, how to talk about it. My first natural instinct reaction was, to keep it quiet, keep it to myself, because it's, in a sense, you're a little bit embarrassed. You don't want people around you to think that you're different or that you're sick necessarily. So you keep it to yourself and you try and, just go through daily life as that is. Just bear with me, get some notes. I guess after leaving high school at the age of 18, finishing that, I wasn't working a great deal and whatnot, so, I started to get heavily into the gym. As I said, because I wasn't working a lot, I went to the gym, 6-7 days a week, quite obsessively. And that only feeded, the addiction of my eating disorder. That carried on for probably the next 4 years, 3-4 years. And that kind of aspect of my life, that took over my life socially. The bulimia, it didn't want me to socialise with anyone. It made it very difficult to catch up with friends for drinks, food. I had a fear of eating in public due to the fact of I had a lot of body image issues, and the eating disorder just takes over. You're not thinking, I guess, normally or whatnot, and everything was a challenge. So I missed a lot of social events, occasions, even just normal nights hanging out with my mates, because I didn't want to eat in front of them, really. It was hard. But yeah, I think when people think of eating disorders and whatnot, they don't think, I guess, of it as a holistic thing, in terms of your social and your physical and emotional and spiritual well-being and stuff. But it affects, all four of them in equal ways, I feel like, in terms of my experience, in such negative ways, but because, you're so caught up in your eating disorder, you can't, it's extremely hard to change, those ways. But yeah, pretty much my kind of experience with therapy. So I was actually, it's a bit of a back and forth kind of story. So at the age of 21, I was severely depressed and had been, for the last kind of 4 or 5 years. And I got into a very dark place, and I actually tried to take my own life. And from that, I was taken to hospital straight away, and then from there admitted to a psych ward. But the reason why I was so depressed was because of the eating disorder, and obviously other things contributed to it as well, but that was the main thing. But it never got dealt with, because I never sought help. And when I was taken to the psych ward, they were so focused just on kind of treating the depression and the anxiety and stuff that they never really dug deeper as to why I was so depressed. But from then I was referred to Headspace services, and I had a psychologist that I worked with again for the next 5 months or so. And yeah, again, we just worked, kind of on the depression and those depressive thoughts and whatnot, and that was great. I worked through that. But as soon as I mentioned, my eating disorder, it was obviously out of her kind of scope of work. But from then I was referred straight from this, kind of public system where, it's free of charge, which makes life a lot easier, obviously, to then a private facility and a private psychologist to then going to, treat my eating disorder. And then, having to pay $160 odd a session, it kind of, you go from, I guess, feeling okay and comfortable in your situation to then, now you feel like you got this kind of financial burden, I guess, over your head. And, in my case, I was very fortunate enough that I live with mum and dad, and they, both have steady and stable jobs, and they were able to help pay for my treatment. But if I didn't have them to depend on, then treatment probably wouldn't have been an option. I would have just, again, had to push it to the side, and I think no doubt I would have, within the next few months, just slipped straight back into that dark place. So I think, in terms of the treatment, I just went through ECBT. And after kind of 12 months, it was a very, very hard journey. If you're not willing to kind of change and put in the work outside of your psychology sessions, it's not going to work. I had homework after every session that I went. And at the start, I was so happy and so keen to make that change and kind of get my life back. And obviously, recovery is not a very linear process. You have hurdles, and I did notice, once, I did have a couple of lapses, and when I wasn't kind of focusing on that homework that my psychologist had assigned me, I was just going backwards so far. So I think it is so important to make sure that, I guess, the client is understanding what you're actually telling them, because I know there was times where, for me, she'd assign me homework, and I'd just kind of be like, I'm not really sure what I'm actually supposed to be doing here. So I think, clarification around all that is great. But yeah, for me, it worked. I put in the work, and 12 months later, I'm here giving this talk. But I guess in terms of what brought me here today, I have a strong passion for males with eating disorders, and not only that, but mental health. It definitely does not get talked about a lot, and that stigma that everyone's aware of, for some reason, blokes shy away from talking about anything to do with emotions. I know personally in my kind of friendship group, until I kind of opened up and started talking about what I'd went through, none of us had ever talked about anything like that, and we'd all been mates for the last 12 years. And as soon as I spoke up, I then discovered, a few of them had been struggling with, depression and just other, kind of anxiety, things like that. It's just very common, but, the fact that they thought that they were by themselves, that there was no one else out there, that was like that, they just felt like they couldn't talk up. So, me being here today, I'm hoping, I can reach out to any age group of male that, if, they are struggling with it, that, it's okay to talk up and make yourself vulnerable for a period of time, because you're not going to regret it. Yeah. That's good. Yeah, that concludes that.
Thank you, Braden, for that very courageous description of what it's like to be young, to have an eating disorder, not to quite know that that's what it is that you've got, not to be able to talk to anybody about it, and even then when you go and you seek help, nobody telling you that that's an eating disorder and nobody providing you with the treatment. And yet the treatment worked when we got the right treatment in place. And I think that's a very powerful message to take away. I'd now like to introduce our last speaker in this session, Shannon Calvert. Shannon is a consumer leader in recovery after having a severe and enduring eating disorder for more than 30 years. She's a member of the Consumer and Carer and Membership Committees of the Australia and New Zealand Academy of Eating Disorders and the International Academy of Eating Disorders. She's a lived experience speaker and trainer and has presented at national and international conferences. Shannon, thank you.
I almost wish I hadn't given you my bio now. Lesley, thank you. And I would like to thank the NEDC as well for your time today and for this opportunity. Most of all, I wanted to actually thank Christine for her talk this morning, which helps me stand firm here and realize why it's so important that I speak today as well. Braden and Ingrid, thank you both. I didn't come prepared today. I chose not to. As much as I say that I'm a lived experience speaker, I only outed myself with having a severe and enduring eating disorder last year. I can't really prepare for talks like this. So I'm going to own my space and be vulnerable and share this time with you. One thing that I did do, actually, I've just trained a group of speakers to be recovery storytellers, and that's broadly in mental health. And I remember asking them, I said to them, why are you doing this? Because if you think that your lived experience is your purpose, then I ask you to step back and breathe. You are not your disorder. You are not your diagnosis. I don't know who I am. I'm discovering my life again at the age of 42. I've lost almost 30 years of it. So to go into midlife crisis and recovery is quite the combination. But I'm here. I do know what I'm not. I'm not anorexic and I'm not bulimic. I'm a person who has a mental illness. It's not my fault. It's not anybody's fault. It's just what it is. Now, if I reflect back on my experience, I must say to you that I don't know what caused it. I don't have a light bulb moment to say, you know, this is what happened. Life happened. I had the kind of personality where I wanted to save the world. I think many of us do. And I realized that I couldn't. And when I started to own that I couldn't fix other people's problems, including my own, including my family's, I became really, really frightened. Sometimes I think it came for the ride with anxiety and depression. But one of my experiences with telling my story is to not get too caught up on the past. You know, one of the opportunities, the privileges of being in recovery is to talk about what didn't work, but mostly to talk about what is working now and what can we do moving forward. So to give you a brief snapshot of my history, gosh, where do I start? I grew up in South Africa, and I don't really know when I developed the eating disorder, but I was a big girl. I was called a big girl because I was tall. You know, I was tall and I seemed confident. I was very good at telling everybody that everything was absolutely fine, but I wasn't. You know, I had my own struggles and I had my own vulnerabilities as well. I think maybe it did start with anorexia. I came from a family that dieted a lot. I think my father, looking back on my history and looking back on my mother, I think predominantly most of my family had disordered eating. But I was the identified patient after a while, so I don't know if anyone's ever going to look back on their history and say, this is my stuff. I've come to a point where I have to acknowledge mine. As much as I could go into years and years of my treatment, it's really hard to give you a snapshot of what's been a 30-year experience. So I'm going to go take it back to what was my most major relapse, and that was around about the age of 28. I was working too hard, I was doing too much, bigger, better, faster, more. I wanted to succeed. I knew I had lost most of my teens, and now I was going to just do it. You know, I was going to make it work. I looked well. Everybody thought I was well, but I wasn't. I worked too hard, I burnt myself out, and I had anorexia nervosa of the binge purge type. So I looked well, and this is one of the reasons why I don't have images up here today. I questioned whether to have a PowerPoint. I don't show images of my past because I don't think you need a poster child for an eating disorder. You know, an eating disorder comes in different shapes and sizes, and when I was overweight, I've had binge eating disorder as well. When I was overweight, I was in turmoil. I probably had the most anorexic type mindset than when I was incredibly underweight as well. So when I had my major relapse at 28, my stomach actually nearly perforated. I was diagnosed with a disorder that was rare that they found out in the emergency room. Basically, my duodenum had completely blocked. And with my anorexia nervosa, I had starved the fat of my insides, but now I was binging as well. So they did a major surgery that was life-threatening, and it was the first of 3. I thought that was it for me, but I managed to keep going. Now, you'd think that would be enough to stop the anorexia nervosa, but it wasn't. You know, I wish it was a choice. I wish I could just say I could just stop this, but it was never that easy. Unfortunately, I was continuous turmoil, and life stopped after that. I stopped working, I stopped living. The challenge being, though, is I didn't have access to treatment, and I also didn't have access to private care. So for the first admission, people started to get really scared. Here was someone that knew that they were struggling, but now they could physically see that I wasn't doing well either. Or most places that I called to try and engage therapy said, we don't do eating disorders. Okay, how could I not hold on to that shame personally myself? I did find a psychiatrist that was willing to support me, and then she got scared. I started to get really sick, and we started to open Pandora's box, and the minute we started to delve into what was incredibly distressing for me, I started to block out, and the eating disorder found its way in. It was seductive. I was placed under the Mental Health Act and placed in an emergency ward under a security guard, and I was probably his easiest job ever. That started a revolving door of going in and out of secure units in a mental health ward for almost 10 years. I was placed in a secure unit in a mental health ward because people didn't want me dying on their shift. They were scared. Here was someone they didn't know how to treat eating disorders. They didn't know much about eating disorders. There were the biological issues. There was the complications as well. My blood pressure would drop to a point where they were having med calls all the time. You stick her in a secure unit, keep an eye on her, she can't die there. But unfortunately that aggravated the trauma, and so now, you know, recovering from PTSD from treatment is one that's going to take some time. But I guess I don't really know what sort of came to my recovery. All I do know that we were planning my end-of-life care in 2010. We were told I was going to die. I had been so highly medicated for my eating disorder that we didn't think that I could move beyond that. So I was actually sent that year, we were preparing for my end of life. And lo and behold, there was a treatment center supposedly that could take me on board overseas. It was a drug and alcohol rehab. I don't do drugs or alcohol, and I don't judge anyone that does, but they wanted to cure me from my addiction that was an eating disorder. I had to call myself a grateful recovering addict for every day for 7 months. Did it work? I looked well coming back. I looked well, but it preserved the eating disorder. And I tell you one thing, when I opened that jar again, it ran rampant. I often say eating disorder is a bit like an abusive relationship. And I will say this to you, I have not been in an abusive relationship, but there was no different. My psychologist, who never gave up on me, once turned around to me and said, "Don't let the bastard grind you down." And I think that was one of the messages that held on in my recovery. When I had a major relapse, fortunately, I was given opportunity to go into a private clinic, but they got scared. I was someone with a severe and enduring eating disorder. And again, I wasn't someone that was having early intervention, and they were frightened. No one wanted me dying. No one wanted to have someone on their books to say that they had died. And I can understand that, but I was sent to old dark territory, and I thought it was going to ruin me. I will say this though, I had a team. I had a small team, a multidisciplinary team, who I sometimes think are angels in my life. A dietitian, a GP, and a psychologist that refused to ever give up on me. It didn't matter what happened, they weren't going to give up. And many, many did along the way. What was pretty powerful for me though, was they found a way for me to have an admission, a short admission that I would say planted the seed to my recovery. It was in a public general hospital. I was placed with a team who knew eating disorders. They had started to educate themselves on eating disorders. They started to have conversations around how would management work for someone with an eating disorder, acknowledging the mental challenges as well as the biological challenges. It was a short-term admission that wasn't actually what made me recover. But like I said, it had planted a seed of compassion, dignity, and respect like no other. The integrity of the clinicians was what was so powerful. From start to finish, they owned the fact that someone needed to rein in to this disorder, but they saw me beyond it. They had conversations with me, they told me what was happening. That helped remind me that when I lapsed, and I lapsed many times, in fact, I hit the ground so many times, I lost count. And when I was down, it was so seductive to stay there. It was safe, I knew it well. I didn't think I would get up again, but I knew I had to, because here was this team of people that were going, "Hey, you're hard work, you're tough," and I'll tell you something, I was hard work. I wasn't aggressive, but my internal stigma and shame was, I think, the hardest thing to challenge. That internal sense of self-worth was far more ingrained than the eating disorder itself. Oh, but it was so seductive. The eating disorder was always the problem, and when we wanted to acknowledge anything else, we could go back there. All I can say is I didn't think that by my mother's dying, she would teach me how to live again. Because if someone had turned around to me and had said, in the most turmoil of times when my mother knew that she was being diagnosed with cancer and that she was going to lose her life, if someone had said, "Shannon, you stop your eating disorder and she'll get better," if that had been enough to stop me, I would have. But what was powerful was my mother turned around to me the one time, and she had every reason to give up more than anybody. Nobody supported her in care. We didn't think we had the right to have that type of support. But she turned around to me the one day when I said, "Mum, I want to come with you." And her honesty and respect to just turn around and say, I know you do. We had a shared conversation of honesty and vulnerability and compassion. She said, "No, my girl, you're going to live." That wasn't what did it. Afterwards, I wanted to give up. I wanted to go with her. But I kept reminding myself that every time I fell, I had to get up again. So I had a strategy about this abusive relationship I was in. I needed an escape plan. I needed to get out. So I decided to expose it for what it was, and that was telling my story. Now, I didn't expect to be where I am today. To be an advocate and to be a peer mentor wasn't the goal. I wasn't going to make my eating disorder my purpose in life. I'm so much more beyond that. But a friend turned around to me and she said, "Shannon, where do you see yourself in 5 years?" This was the easiest answer I've ever had in my life. I see myself in 5 years. So I guess if I look back what Christine said, if we look at the changes from 2009 to 2015, huge changes, huge. It's not enough though. And I guess what is most powerful, and some points that I made here, is although I'm a 40-year-old woman, 42-year-old woman now, reflecting on a lifetime, I think where I'm coming from is with passion and hope of recovery for anyone. Early intervention doesn't discriminate. It doesn't have to be youth. If anyone is showing any indication of an eating disorder, get in there. Get in there and start helping. I guess what's most important is to not look for an eating disorder. You don't have to be a professional in eating disorders. Just don't be looking for something. You need to know what eating disorders are, because you'll have many people that will come through the door and you might not see what you're looking for. I guess ultimately eating disorders are everybody's business. It's not something you go out there and study. We have come so far, but we can't stop here. And I just want to say to you, and I've seen it happen before as a peer mentor, as an advocate, as a consumer leader in recovery, there are many people out there that can recover and will recover, and all of us here can help them. So thank you all so much for your time.
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Ingrid. Thank you, Braden, for sharing 3 very different stories that nonetheless had some very similar themes within them. And I think Shannon summed it up. Get in there and do something about it. Get in there early. Ask the questions. Recognise the risk factors. And do something about it. And that surely is what we're all here for today. We have unfortunately run out of time in this session. I do believe tea may be waiting for us, and it's one of the most important meals of the day, at least in my life. But our 3 speakers have very generously said they'll be around, and if you'd like to go and have a conversation with them, ask them questions, they'd certainly like to talk to you. And at least 2 of them will be here tomorrow as well, and joining in the very interactive workshops that we're having tomorrow to look at how we do in fact get in there and do something. So you will have the benefit of their wisdom again tomorrow, as well as a number of other people who I know are here in the audience today with lived experience. So we can wrap that into the knowledge that we have for tomorrow. Thank you all very much.